He drank bat blood to survive 11 days alone in the Sahara Desert. The sand tasted like death. Mauro Prosperi spat out another mouthful, his cracked lips bleeding onto his swollen tongue. Around him, the Sahara screamed, a wall of ochre fury that swallowed the sky, the sun, the entire world. He couldn't see his hand in front of his face. The compass strapped to his wrist spun uselessly, mocking him with its directionless dance. Just 30 minutes ago, he'd been running alongside 200 other competitors in the Marathon des Sables, the most brutal footrace on Earth. Now, he was utterly, catastrophically alone. The roar of the sandstorm drowned out his screams for help, and with each passing second, the wind dragged him farther from the course, farther from civilization, farther from any hope of being found. The year was 1994, and Mauro Prosperi was living his dream. At 39 years old, the Italian police officer and Olympic pentathlete had trained for months to compete in the Marathon des Sables, a 6-day, 250-kilometer ultramarathon across the Moroccan Sahara. It was a race that separated the elite from the merely exceptional, a test of endurance that pushed human beings to their absolute limits. Competitors carried their own food and gear, racing through temperatures that regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit, sleeping in communal tents under stars that blazed like distant fires. Mauro had been prepared for pain. He'd trained in the Italian countryside, running with a weighted pack until his feet bled and his muscles screamed. He'd studied nutrition, memorized survival techniques, and visualized crossing the finish line 1,000 times. He'd said goodbye to his wife and children with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. But no amount of training could prepare him for what happened on the 4th day of the race. The morning had started beautifully. Mauro woke in his tent as the first light painted the dunes in shades of rose and gold. He'd been running well, maintaining a strong position in the middle of the pack. His feet were blistered but manageable, his spirits high. After a quick breakfast of freeze-dried food and carefully rationed water, he'd set out across the desert floor, following the course markers that organizers had planted in the sand. By midday, the heat was crushing. The sun hammered down from a cloudless sky, turning the air into a shimmering furnace. Mauro ran with his head down, focusing on the rhythm of his breathing, the steady crunch of his footfalls on the packed sand. Around him, other runners spread out across the landscape like ants on an enormous beach. Then, without warning, the horizon disappeared. At first, it looked like a distant smudge, a brown haze rising from the earth. Mauro had seen sandstorms before, brief squalls that came and went like desert ghosts. But this was different. This wall of sand rose hundreds of feet into the air, advancing with terrifying speed. Within minutes, it had swallowed the horizon entirely. The race officials began shouting in French and English, their voices urgent and sharp. "Take cover! Get down! Cover your face!" Mauro dropped to his knees, pulling his emergency foil blanket from his pack. He wrapped it around his head and body, trying to create a protective cocoon against the approaching maelstrom. Around him, other runners did the same, hunching against the sand, becoming small as possible. The storm hit like a freight train. Sand blasted against Mauro's makeshift shelter with the force of buckshot. The wind howled, a sound so loud it seemed to come from inside his own skull. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his face against his knees, trying desperately to protect his airways from the choking dust. The world became nothing but noise and fury, a violent chaos that went on and on and on. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost all meaning inside the storm. When the wind finally began to ease, when the roar faded to a dull howl, Mauro slowly unwrapped himself and looked up. He was alone. Completely, utterly alone. The landscape had been transformed. Dunes had migrated, landmarks had vanished, and the course markers, Those crucial flags that showed the way forward had been buried or blown away entirely. Morrow stood slowly, his legs shaking, and turned in a full circle. Sand stretched to every horizon, an endless sea of beige and brown beneath a sky that was still hazy with dust. "Hello." His voice came out as a croak. "Hello." Nothing. No response. No sign of the other runners, the support vehicles, the race officials. Just silence and sand. Morrow checked his compass, but the needle spun wildly, affected by the magnetic interference common in the Sahara. He pulled out his small map, now torn and sandblasted, and tried to orient himself. But without landmarks, without the sun clearly visible through the lingering dust, it was impossible to determine his position. He made a decision that would seal his fate. He started walking. At first, Morrow told himself he was being rational. The race organizers would be looking for him. If he just kept moving in what he thought was the right direction, he'd eventually cross paths with the course or a search party. He had water, not much, but enough for a few hours. He had some food. He was strong, trained, and experienced in the outdoors. He would be fine. But as the sun began to set, painting the dunes in deep shadows and blood-orange light, Morrow realized how desperately wrong he might be. He'd been walking for hours without seeing a single sign of civilization. No tire tracks. No footprints. No aircraft overhead. Just endless, rolling sand in every direction. As darkness fell completely, the temperature plummeted. The Sahara, which baked at well over 100 degrees during the day, became bitterly cold at night. Morrow wrapped himself in his emergency blanket and huddled against a dune, shivering violently. Above him, stars emerged in their millions, so bright and numerous they seemed to form a solid ceiling of light. Under other circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Now it only emphasized his isolation, all that vast universe, and him alone in the dark. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every sound made him jump, the whisper of sand sliding down a dune face, the distant cry of something that might have been a bird or a fox. When dawn finally came, he stood on stiff legs and continued walking. Day 2 in the desert. Morrow's water was running low. His lips had begun to crack and bleed. His tongue felt thick in his mouth. He rationed carefully, allowing himself only small sips, but mathematics was against him. A human being in desert heat could lose up to 2 liters of water per hour through sweat. He simply didn't have enough liquid to survive for long. By mid-morning, he saw it, a structure on the horizon. At first, he thought it was a mirage, a trick of the heat waves that made the air shimmer like water. But as he stumbled closer, his heart hammering with desperate hope, the building solidified into reality. It was a marabou, a small Muslim shrine or tomb, built of mud brick and worn smooth by centuries of wind and sand. The roof had partially collapsed, and the doorway gaped like an empty mouth, but it was shelter. It was real. It was something. Morrow practically fell through the entrance, collapsing onto the sandy floor inside. The interior was dim and blessedly cool, protected from the direct assault of the sun. Ancient Arabic script decorated the walls, and in one corner, he could make out what looked like the remains of a burial site. He drank the last of his water. The implications of that action hit him slowly, seeping into his consciousness like blood into sand. He was out of water. Completely out. And he was in the middle of the Sahara Desert with no idea which direction to walk to find help. Morrow spent the rest of that day in the marabou, conserving energy, trying to think clearly through the fog of dehydration that was already clouding his mind. That evening, as the last light faded from the doorway, he heard a sound that made his heart leap, a rustling, fluttering sound coming from above. Bats. Hundreds of them, hanging from the exposed beams of the partially collapsed roof. They began to emerge with the darkness, flying out of the marabou to hunt for insects. Morrow watched them go, and something shifted in his mind. Something primal. Something that had nothing to do with civilization or morality or the man he'd been before entering this desert. Bats had moisture in their bodies. Blood was liquid. The thought was repulsive. It was also undeniable. On the third day, driven by a thirst so intense it felt like his throat was lined with broken glass, Morrow acted. He waited until dusk when the bats began to stir. Then, moving slowly, he positioned himself beneath a cluster of them. His hands shook, from weakness, from horror at what he was about to do, from the simple desperate need to survive. He reached up and grabbed one. The bat shrieked and struggled, its wings beating against his palm. Morrow didn't let himself think. He bit down on the creature's body, feeling the tiny bones crunch between his teeth, tasting the warm, coppery flood of blood that filled his mouth. It was disgusting. It was one of the most awful things he'd ever experienced. The texture, the taste, the wrongness of it all made him gag. But he swallowed. And then he caught another bat. And another. This became his routine. During the day, he sheltered from the sun in the marabou, barely moving, trying to conserve every ounce of energy. At night, he hunted bats, consuming their blood and occasionally their flesh, gagging through every bite but forcing himself to swallow. Days blurred together. 3 became 4. 4 became 5. Morrow's body was cannibalizing itself, burning through muscle and fat to stay alive. His reflection in the small piece of mirror from his emergency kit showed a stranger. Sunken eyes, skin stretched tight over bones, lips so cracked they were more scab than flesh. He tried to leave the marabou several times, walking in different directions in hopes of finding help. But the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, and each time he ventured out, he barely had the strength to make it back to his shelter before collapsing. On what he estimated was the 7th day, Morrow Prosperi decided to die. He'd thought about it before, of course. The idea had been circling in his mind like a vulture, drawing closer each day. But now he made an active decision. He would not spend another day in this hell. He would not force down another bat. He would not wake up one more time to the crushing realization that he was still alive, still trapped, still suffering. He thought about his wife, his children. He thought about them finding out that he'd died alone in the desert, and the thought broke something inside him. But he was so tired, so desperately, bone-deep tired. Morrow used a small knife from his emergency kit to cut into his wrists. The blade was dull, and his hands shook badly, but he managed to open the veins. He lay down on the sandy floor of the marabou, watching the blood well up from the cuts. And then something strange happened. The blood didn't flow. Not really. It welled up thick and syrupy, more like sap than liquid. Dehydration had made his blood so viscous, so concentrated, that it was clotting almost immediately. The cuts crusted over with dark scabs. He couldn't even bleed properly. Morrow lay there for a long time, staring at his wrists, at the failed suicide attempt written across his skin. Then, slowly, he began to laugh. It was a cracked, broken sound, more sob than laughter, but it was something. The desert wouldn't even let him die with dignity. Fine, he thought. Fine. If I can't die, I'll walk. On day 8, Morrow left the marabou for the last time. He had nothing left. No water, no food, no strength to speak of. But he had stubbornness, and he had rage, and those twin fuels burned hot enough to get him moving. He walked without direction, without hope, simply putting one foot in front of the other because the alternative was lying down and waiting for the end. The landscape began to change. The towering dunes gave way to harder packed earth, scattered rocks, occasional scrub brush clinging to life in the hostile environment. Morrow barely noticed. He was beyond noticing much of anything now, moving in a fugue state where thought and sensation had become distant, unimportant things. He walked through day 8, through day 9. On day 10, he fell and couldn't get up for several hours. When he finally did, he continued walking, his gait more of a stumbling lurch than anything resembling a normal stride. On the morning of the 11th day, Morrow saw figures on the horizon. At first, he was sure they were hallucinations. His mind had been playing tricks on him for days, showing him water that wasn't there, buildings that vanished when he approached, the faces of his family appearing in the shadows and heat shimmer. But these figures didn't disappear. As he stumbled toward them, they became more solid, more real. A small encampment. Goats. Tents. People. Nomadic Berber people, Algerians who lived in and knew the desert like he knew the streets of his Italian hometown. They saw him coming, this skeletal, sunburned thing lurching toward them out of the wasteland, and rushed to help. Morrow tried to speak, but his swollen tongue wouldn't form words. He tried to explain, to tell them about the race, about the storm, about everything that had happened. But all that came out was a rasping croak. The nomads gave him water, just a little at first, then more as his body proved it could handle it. They gave him shelter, food, care. They sent word to the authorities. When race officials finally reached him, Morrow Prosperi had been missing for 11 days. He'd lost 13 kilograms, nearly 30 pounds. He'd walked approximately 186 miles in the wrong direction, crossing from Morocco into Algeria. He was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from exposure, but he was alive. The rescue made international news. The marathon runner who'd survived nearly 2 weeks alone in the Sahara, who'd drunk bat blood to stay alive, who'd walked across an international border without knowing it. Reporters wanted to know how he'd done it. What had kept him going? Morrow's answer was simple. I didn't want my wife to have to explain to our children that their father had died out there. I had to come back. He was airlifted to a hospital, where it took weeks for his body to recover from the ordeal. His feet were so damaged from the endless walking that doctors worried he might never run again. His digestive system had to be carefully reintroduced to normal food. Psychologically, he grappled with what he'd been through. The loneliness, the desperation, the moment he'd tried to end his own life. But Morrow Prosperi did recover. And remarkably, incredibly, he ran again. 2 years later, he returned to the Marathon des Sables. He lined up at the starting line with hundreds of other runners, many of whom knew his story. When the starting gun fired, Morrow ran out into the Sahara once more, this time completing the race he'd started. People asked him why. Why would anyone return to the place of such trauma, such suffering? Why risk it again? Morrow's answer revealed something profound about human nature, about our relationship with fear and adversity. The desert didn't defeat me. I had to go back to prove that I was stronger than what happened to me there. His story became legendary in the ultramarathon community, a testament to the incredible resilience of the human body and spirit. It raised important questions about race safety, about the limits of human endurance, about what we're willing to risk in pursuit of our goals. But perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated something that Morrow himself learned in those 11 days of hell. That the will to survive, the drive to return to the people we love, can push us beyond what we ever imagined possible. That even in the darkest moments, when we've lost everything including hope, the human spirit has a capacity for endurance that borders on miraculous. The Sahara is still there, vast and unforgiving, indifferent to human suffering. And somewhere in that immensity, a small marabou still stands, its walls holding the memory of the man who lived and died and lived again within its shelter, sustained by bat blood and the thought of home. Mauro Prosperi is now in his 60s. He still runs. He speaks about his experience to audiences around the world, sharing the lessons he learned in those 11 days. When people tell him they could never do what he did, he corrects them. You could, he says. You just don't know it yet. We're all capable of far more than we think. We just hope we never have to find out how much. If Mauro Prosperi's story of survival against impossible odds moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories of human endurance. What would you do if you were lost in the Sahara Desert? Could you drink bat blood to survive? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, you're stronger than you think you are. You just hope you never have to prove it. Until next time, stay curious, stay strong, and I'll see you in the next video.